In my videos, I repeatedly suggest that the false self is a kind of imaginary friend of the child that goes awry, that loses its fundamental, essential, primordial functions and become a demanding Moloch, a godlike, divine entity which devours the child, asks for continuous, lifelong human sacrifices, and is all around nasty, brutish, and not very short. Today we're going to discuss the concept of imaginary friend based on recent literature and observations and the connections between imaginary friend and the false self. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm your imaginary author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and a not imaginary professor of psychology. Okay, let's start with the fact that the majority of children have imaginary friends. By some estimates, 65% of children. Imaginary friends are very common in early childhood. They are a very normal feature of cognitive and emotional development. But the problem starts when the imaginary friend refuses to recede, refuses to succumb and give its place to more advanced constructs, internal psychological processes, and a general maturity of the personality. The key challenge is to distinguish between typical imaginary friends, typical play, ludic behavior, play with these imaginary friends, typical interactions between very young children and their imaginary friends, giving the imaginary friend a name, kind of invented biography, attributing to the imaginary friend all kinds of powers, including divine powers, the creation of a proto-primitive individual religion. These are all quite normal. They are not even on the border between normal and abnormal. They're pretty normal. But the imaginary friend sometimes becomes so entrenched, so all-consuming, so all-pervasive, so ominous, that it signals the emergence of a psychopathology, some kind of perhaps emotional distress, adverse circumstances, neurodevelopmental concerns or disorders. All of them impact the content of the imaginary friend, the behavior, attributable behavior of the imaginary friend, the qualities and traits the child endows upon or bestows upon the imaginary friend, and definitely the type of interaction. Critical to realize that an imaginary friend, first and foremost, is imaginary. It's a narrative. It's a piece of fiction. It's a fictional character. And it is created mentally. But while it is created mentally, it somehow assumes external qualities. It becomes a kind of external object. This confusion between internal object and external object, something that emerges from the imagination, emanates from one's mind as a figment, and then acquires its own life, its own existence out there. This confusion between internal and external is at the core of many mental health pathologies. For example, pathological narcissism. It's also at the core of other forms of mental illness known as religions. Okay, so the child creates this character, fictional character, and then begins to use it as a receptacle or a container for all kinds of data, information, and stimuli. So the character acquires a name, and then some kind of, as I said, contours of a biography, and the child begins to interact with the character as if the character were real. This kind of confusion between internal and external object survives into adulthood in narcissistic personalities and in psychotic people with psychosis, in psychotic disorders. So children talk to these invisible imaginary friends. They have tea with them. They share secrets with them. They become best friends. They walk together everywhere. and only the child can see the imaginary friend. This is part of normal development, nothing to worry about. It is also an integral element in the child's emerging grandiosity. For the child to separate from mommy, to say goodbye to mother, and then to explore the world, interact with peers, endure the pains and losses of reality. For the child to do all this at the tender age of 18 months or 2 years or 3 years, the child needs to be a bit grandiose, needs to feel a bit godlike, as if the child has some self-imputed impunity or immunity. And so the imaginary friend is a kind of projection of this grandiosity. It's an extension of this grandiosity. And usually the imaginary friend has many qualities and traits and behaviors and cognitions and emotions which are either the opposite of the child's or an extension of the child's, so something the child would have liked to have. Similarly, when the false self is created by the child who is about to become a narcissist, the false self is everything the child is not. The child is helpless. The false self is omnipotent, all-powerful. The child cannot guess, cannot decipher or decode the minds of adults who are abusive and traumatizing or instrumentalizing or parentifying or overprotective and so on. The false self is all-knowing, is omniscient. The child assumes that something is wrong with it. The child adopts or internalizes a beta object. I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, something's wrong with me. I'm the cause of my parents' divorce. I'm guilty, I'm ashamed, and so on. The false self is exactly the opposite. It's a perfect being. It's godlike. So the false self is an imaginary friend in this sense, because imaginary friends are exactly like this. It seems, therefore, that the child goes through a period, most children go through a period of pathological narcissism, in effect. Grandiosity coupled with a false self, an imaginary friend. So how come we don't end up being stuck in pathological narcissism, la la land? Because we get rid of the imaginary friend and we no longer need these defenses. We no longer need to falsify reality, most of us. And then this tiny minority, about 1 to 2%, who are effectively stuck in this developmental phase and cannot emerge or exit. And so with age and cognitive maturation, imaginary friends are no longer needed, and in this sense they're comparable to what is known as a transitional object. Okay, 65% of children have had an imaginary friend by age 7, according to studies by Marjorie Taylor and Stephanie Carlson and many others. You can read a few of these studies in the academic journal, Developmental Psychology. Among imaginary friends still active at age 7, 67% were invisible. 33% were personified objects, such as a stuffed animal, for example, even a blanket. And this stuffed animal had a distinct personality. So here we see a situation where a transitional object, I mentioned a blanket, a transitional object, something the child uses to transition from self-preoccupation, what Freud called narcissistic libido, to object libido, to preoccupation with others. So this transition from self to others, transitional objects such as a blanket, a teddy bear, they fulfill the role of others. They allow the child to move smoothly and seamlessly from one position to the next. An imaginary friend is a transitional object that has acquired a life of its own, has been animated by the child, endowed with a personality and a biography, and therefore continues to fulfill transitional functions in the fostering and the maturation of object relations. Let me translate this to English. The child uses the imaginary friend to exercise, to rehearse, to try out things, to experiment, when it comes to relationships with other people. The child uses the imaginary friend as a stand-in for other people, a substitute for other people, and then continues to interact with the imaginary friend in a safe environment of the child's own making, and acquires the skills needed, social skills needed, to go out into the world and interact with other people. So imaginary friend is a foil, is a rehearsal space. It's like the child learns how to interact with other people by interacting with these imaginary people, imaginary friend. That's great. That's healthy. Studies show that having an imaginary friend is not only common, and it's also normative, is positively associated with better emotional understanding and an enhanced ability to take other people's perspective. In other words, the imaginary friend is a crucial element in the development of empathy. The child starts by empathizing with the imaginary friend. Something goes awry, something goes wrong in the path from imaginary friend to false self. At some point, the child makes a decision that now that it has an imaginary friend, it is not in need of any other people, of anyone else. Like, the imaginary friend is it. I don't need anyone else. Why would I look for other people? The imaginary friend is everything I ever wanted, everything I ever wished. It's a perfect match. It's like going on a dating app and finding the perfect match. So why would I continue to be on a dating app? So the child gets married to the imaginary friend, so to speak, a monogamous relationship. And the child gets disconnected, detached from the reality of object relations, the reality of other people. It is when the imaginary friend becomes a full-fledged substitute to object relations that we have the false self. One of the reasons the child makes this bizarre choice is that the false self is perfect. It's a perfect being. It's infallible, it's omniscient, it's omnipotent, it's beautiful, it's everything. And on the other hand, the alternatives, real people, are hurtful, they're painful, they're imperfect, they're sometimes stupid, they're demanding. So why would anyone in his right mind not choose the false self over other people, says the child. And this kind of child remains stuck. Why does this not happen universally? Why don't all children remain stuck with an imaginary friend and disconnect from other people completely? Because not all children grow up in dysfunctional households with bad parenting. Now, it's important to understand that when I use the words abuse and trauma, it means any situation where the parents refuses to allow the child to evolve, to separate, to individuate, to have boundaries. Any situation. A spoiling and pampering parent is equally abusive as an incestuous parent, for example. So, in all these situations where there is disqualified, not good enough parenting, to borrow a phrase from Winnicott, in all these situations, the child would naturally gravitate towards the false self and make a preference, prefer the false self to others. And so, Tanya Ruiz, who is a psychopedagogue specializing in learning and educational psychology, and she's also the therapeutic coordinator at Anda Conmigo, a Spanish network of multidisciplinary centers for children and so on and so forth. So she says imaginary friends appear as a natural part of the development of symbolic play and imagination. They are most frequent between ages 3 and 7, a period marked by intense creativity, during which the distinction between fantasy and reality is still under construction. It is there that the narcissist remains stuck. This is the reason the narcissist interacts with the world via fantasy. This is the reason why the false self takes over. This is the reason why the false self isolates the narcissistic child later to become a narcissist, isolates the child. This is the reason why the child gives up on reality testing, gives up on other people, object relations, and so on and so forth. Imaginary friends uh, can take many forms: people, animals, animated objects, fantastical beings, and so on and so forth. Ruiz says, beyond appearance, what matters is the function they serve. Some provide protection, others act as play companions, and others embody aspects of the child, such as bravery or strength. Through these figures, children organize the inner world and rehearse the management of needs, desires, and conflicts. This could become a lifelong fixture, clinical feature, because if the environment doesn't offer a more enticing, more organized alternative, the child has no reason to let go of this adaptive solution, this positive adaptation. Emotionally, imaginary friends allow children to express forbidden feelings like fear, anger, sadness. They allow children to kind of express desires, such as desires which are unmet, desires which are prescribed, or desires which are unrealistic, and so on and so forth. Children very often prefer to not communicate directly. Any child clinician would tell you that children are much better at expressing themselves via painting or drawing, symbolically, rather than directly communicating. Children therefore use imaginary friends as tools to make sense of their own emotions and to practice all kinds of coping strategies. This is the emotional side. But the imaginary friend also caters to the cognitive side, because these types of play stimulate language development, narrative skills, planning, cognitive flexibility, and symbolic thinking. Also, socially, the imaginary friend allows the child to exercise, to acquire, and to enhance and improve intersocial skills, their interpersonal skills. The child creates stories, dialogues, scenarios, and within these, the child exercises executive function, problem-solving abilities, and social skills. So there is a very thin line, sometimes glacial and imperceptible, between this healthy, normative picture and pathological narcissism, the area, the zone of clinical concern. Ruiz says, concern arises when play becomes rigid. The child does not tolerate questioning or modifying the imaginary friend. The content is persistently violent or aggressive. The presence of the friend causes distress, isolation, or fear, or when it coexists with other warning signs involving language, social interaction, or behavior. So in all these disparate, different situations, there is clinical concern. Of course, in the case of the narcissist, or the child who is about to become a narcissist, the false self is rigid. The child doesn't tolerate questioning or modifying the imaginary friend. The content is aggressive or counter-dependent, if you wish. And the presence of the friend causes a reduction in anxiety and a feeling of being protected. It's a protector self-state. And so it's not distress, isolation, or fear. It's the exact opposite. It's actually a parental function or parental ambience. The false self is strongly parental. Initially, it's maternal. It provides a secure base, but later on, it acquires paternal traits as well. Finally, it becomes two parents, two parental, biparental. So most children have imaginary friends, and these imaginary friends emerge within certain developmental limits, and then when you cross a boundary, the developmental boundary, they disappear and they get assimilated. Now, there is room to argue that in all future adult relationships, we tend to superimpose the imaginary friend on other people. For example, intimate romantic partners, friends, best friends, and so on. we tend to idealize them. And idealization is a form of rendering other people, significant others, imaginary friends. We are converting other people, significant others, into imaginary friends by idealizing them or um, falling in love with them. Infatuation and limerence may be an extension of imaginary friend dynamics. But imaginary friends which persist beyond a certain age, usually we believe it's age 7, maybe 9. If imaginary friends persist beyond this age group, then we have a problem. And in majority of cases, the problem is pathological narcissism. These imaginary friends are associated with dysregulation, emotion dysregulation, intense fear, anxiety, sleep problems, and so on and so forth, which are very common in the etiology of pathological narcissism. Significant adverse childhood experiences or stressors or life changes, I don't know, divorce, parental separation, domestic violence, or on the other hand, parentifying the child, instrumentalizing the child, or being overprotective and spoiling and pampering, all these actually stress the child, believe it or not. Because in all these, there are implicit expectations which the child feels that it cannot fulfill. So the child begins to develop what is known as an internalized bad object. Challenges with social interaction or language in neurodevelopmental disorders also lead to the persistence of an imaginary friend. And this is one of the reasons that current thinking begins to see a lot of similarities between autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and personality disorders such as narcissistic personality disorder. Behavioral problems. When the child uses the imaginary friend to justify actions or to avoid responsibility, this gives rise to alloplastic defenses. The fantasy becomes a self-justifying fantasy, a fantasy that exempts the child from responsibility and accountability. In these situations, the imaginary friend is not the cause of the difficulties, but a potential indicator that the child is somehow attempting to cope with internal dynamics or external experiences which are overwhelming, which are too much. I mentioned ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. In ADHD, imaginary friends are much more common than in non-ADHD children, maybe up to 90%, maybe more. And imaginary friends in ADHD serve as a space for creative expression and internal play, and they are not initially inherently worrisome. Like you don't need to worry initially in ADHD. So even though ADHD children are much more likely to come up with a fleshed out three-dimensional imaginary friend which is as real to them as real people, there's no need to worry initially. But in some cases, when the imaginary friend encourages the ADHD child to be impulsive, or when there's a difficulty to distinguish imagined events from actually occurring events, events that actually happened. In other words, when we're beginning to see fantasy defenses that blur the line between external and internal, and when we're beginning to see the legitimization of aggression and impulsivity, recklessness and defiance via the imaginary friend, then we have a problem. And it also may indicate a transition from ADHD to pathological narcissism and even psychopathy. These issues are typically addressed through interventions and so on. In autism spectrum disorder, the situation is a bit different. Many children with autism have difficulty to develop complex symbolic play. They make everything concrete. They are not very good at symbolizing things. And this means that imaginary friends in autism spectrum disorders are less common than in the general population. When imaginary friends do make an appearance, It is important to determine whether the behavior reflects functional symbolic play or some restricted interest, rigid outlines, concrete thinking, literal thinking, that the child transforms into some kind of constant presence. In other words, is the imaginary friend an internal construct that is projected or externalized, or is it the child, or does the child perceive it as real, a separate existence? In all these cases, imaginary friends are never interpreted in isolation, but within the context of the child's overall developmental profile. Imaginary friend is a precarious terrain because it can become pathologized. The child can transition from mental health, normal development, to a psychopathology via the mediation of the imaginary friend. So the imaginary friend, as I said, is a container or receptacle of the pathology. You need to observe it very carefully. And in pathological narcissism, the imaginary friend is not only lifelong, but it is the dummy that took over the ventriloquist.